Welcome. Today, we are going to talk about a topic that Mike and I see very regularly in the kids we work with. And Mike, that is
learned helplessness in kids with ADHD.
Welcome to the ADHD Guys podcast with Mike McLeod of GrowNOW ADHD and Ryan Wexelblatt of ADHD Dude. Learn about parenting kids with ADHD from two male licensed professionals who specialize in ADHD and executive functions. No fluffy parenting advice, only practical information that will help you help your child.
So let's start off by defining what learned helplessness is. So why don't you give your definition, and then I want to see if I want to add anything onto that.
So learned helplessness is exactly what it says. It is a learned behavior. So kids will learn through experience, through success of using this behavior, that when they act like they're incapable of doing something, because they know their parent will do it for them. So whether it's something like homework or a chore or any non-preferred task, when the child will start to use self-defeating comments and will start to express negativity around a task presented to them simply to escape having to do it, and they know the parent will step in and do it for them because the parent deep down has a lot of difficulty watching the child struggle.
And Mike, I want to mention too that I think it's important to say that a lot of kids don't, have any language, around this, that sometimes they're just very passive. So I'm thinking of one kid that we both worked with who would not do homework unless his mother was sitting there next to him. And when she brought this up to me, and I asked her, I said, well, and he was, 14 at the time. I said, what will happen if, you go away and let him do homework on his own? She said, he'll just sit there. She said, so I have to sit next to him and make it, fun and do games and everything. And I said, how long have you been doing this for? And she said, since he's been in school. I said, so what you're describing to me is learned helplessness. He knows that if he acts helpless, you will basically spoon feed him the homework. And not only is that not helpful because one, he's not developing the resiliency to get through something not interesting. Okay. But he's lacking, age expected independence for his age. And he's learning that, if I'm just passive, then maybe adults will do things for me and rescue me from them.
Exactly. And just like most of these behaviors we talk about, learned helplessness is also something neurotypical kids will do. It's just going to be magnified and amplified with the ADHD child. But expressing just how it is a learned behavior, and ADHD kids and teenagers will do this more and more because they're having success with it. So a parent's inability to watch their child struggle. And another big thing is parents doing things for their child that they know their child is capable of doing on their own. So the kids will learn to have behaviors around certain tasks simply to escape, avoid, and not have to do it because the adults are sort of helicoptering, being permissive, and sort of not allowing the child to take accountability on their own.
Mike, I'm thinking of another case of a family I know where this, and I'm not saying this with any judgment, but this mother, admittedly, she needed to feel needed by her kids and would do everything for them. And, at one point, I remember one time her son wanted to wear these certain pants to school. And it was, like an hour before school one morning. And he said, I need to have these pants washed. And she said, why? And she said, he said, well, I need to wear them. And she said, well, wear something else. He said, no, then, I'm not going to do it. So, instead of just saying, okay, well, I can't help you, what did she do? She went and washed the pants for him and rescued him. And that's another example of learned helplessness. It can almost look like passive aggressive behavior.
Exactly.
With
yeah.
Kids. Yeah.
Yeah. And it really goes hand in hand with another aspect of ADHD, which is that cognitive inflexibility. So it's presenting itself as, very rigid thinking, very black and white thinking that the ADHD child will often have. But the question for you as the parent, are you going to accommodate inflexibility, or are you going to step in and allow the child to take accountability, be a little uncomfortable in that moment, have to do some problem-solving planning to figure out how they're going to get this thing done themselves to be able to persevere through that task without so much adult assistance?
I think we should talk a little bit about why, learned helplessness develops. I mean, you touched on that a little bit, but, the reasons I see are, number one, because, kids with ADHD, obviously they have difficulty sustaining attention to other things not interesting to them. Two, they lack the resiliency to persevere through non-preferred tasks. They might not realize how long something will take, right? Because of their difficulty with conceptualizing time. So they might think something will take much longer than it will. Thus, they, engage in learned helplessness. It could be their difficulty with nonverbal working memory. So they can't visualize the end result. So there's not one reason why kids engage with learned helplessness. There's a bunch specifically for kids with ADHD.
Exactly. And that phrase that you just said, we say this so often. Kids with ADHD lack the resiliency to persevere through a non-preferred task. The only way they're going to gain that resiliency, gain that grit, gain that crucial life skill, because let's be honest, 90% of life is non-preferred tasks, paying bills, working, grocery shopping, hygienic tasks, all these things are not instantly gratifying like screens and different things the ADHD brain is drawn to. So the only way for a child to gain resiliency to persevere through non-preferred tasks is to get through the task, and to do it with scaffolding support, fading back to independence. It doesn't mean you do it for them. It doesn't mean you step in and save them from it. You can provide a little bit of scaffolding and a little bit of help, but you got to fade that back towards independence as quickly as possible.
Mike, one of the things I want to tell you is, my video that I have about homework and learned helplessness, a parent left, I think twice this has happened, a parent left a comment on the video saying, can this help with adults with learned helplessness? And then, another parent left something, said, well, my husband still does this and he has ADHD. And the reason I bring this up is to say that, it's obviously not that uncommon, if I've had 2 comments about it, that this is something that some adults with ADHD will still do. Now, is that the norm? I don't think so, but I think it's something that parents should know about, that if we don't address this might go into adulthood. And, I don't think we have any research data to back that up, but, I don't think these people just made that up of 2 different ones, right? Made a comment on my video about it. So let's talk a little bit about, the different, things we can do to help kids move out of learned helplessness. And I think, Mike, the first thing that we need to mention is that with the things we're going to tell you, this is a case where things may get worse before they get better, because for kids with ADHD, when we put more expectations on them, when we put more demands on them, which is fine because your child does not have pathological demand avoidance, no matter what you read, listen to an upcoming episode about that. Okay. Correct. When you put more demands on kids with ADHD, of course, they're going to make noise, as we spoke about recently, and they're going to resist because you're requiring them to think more. You're making their life a little more harder. And what they're going to get out of that is they're going to develop an age-expected level of independence. And when I say age-expected, what I mean is, similar to their same age peers. And as we know, the way confidence builds is through you recognizing your abilities within yourself, not from sitting in a therapist's office, not from somebody telling you how great you are. So not only is helping kids move out of learned helplessness going to help them with independence, it's also going to help their confidence as well. So just keep that in mind. So, Mike, why don't we start off by talking about some, tangible things that parents can do to help when they realize their kids engage in a lot of learned helplessness?
Well, I would say the number one thing is what I said earlier, is parents have to learn to, figure out what is this child's, baseline set of skills, what is their age, what are they capable of doing on their own where I can fade back. Because many parents, especially parents of kids with ADHD, even neurotypical parents, end up doing more for their child than needed, especially in today's day and age with school and homework and, setting up play dates and social and things like that. Don't do things for your child is capable of doing on their own. And a big piece of that is fade yourself back, set that expectation, and allow your child to have those natural consequences. So parents get so caught up in, but what's the consequence? But what's the consequence? And if I leave it up for natural consequences, it'll take too long, or he just won't care, or he'll just starve, or he won't care if he gets an F. He won't care about those things. You have to allow those things to take place. You have to allow those things to happen. And if he's getting poor grades, that has to be a discussion with the teacher, with the counselor, whoever it may be. You cannot allow yourself to become your child's educational secretary. And we can talk about that as well with learned helplessness. But right now, the biggest thing is, stop doing so much for your child, fade back, and allow them to experience natural consequences when they forget something or don't meet an expectation.
So, Mike, I want to bring up a point about that from, with the story. A parent reached out to me a few years ago and, it was a complete case of learned helplessness. Same thing, sitting with the, 14-year-old son, doing his homework with him, completely acting as his executive functioning, organizing all his school materials, telling him what he had for homework every day. And I said to her, exactly what you just said. I said, look, if you want him to improve his executive function skills, you're going to have to stop engaging in his learned helplessness here and allow him to experience the natural consequences of that. And she said to me, I can't allow my son to fail. And I said to her with some empathetic honesty, listen, I have to be honest and tell you what you're doing right now is you're setting him up for failure because he is not going to function in college if he continues on this path and with this dynamic that the two of you, have right now. So I hear that you don't want him to fail, but he can either fail now or he can fail when he gets to college. I recommend that you will let him experience the natural consequences in 8th grade, not when he's away at college.
And it's so important for parents to understand just how serious that is. I have personally seen that happen an insane number of times. The amount of students that get so much assistance from the parents, from an IEP, from a 504, and they're able to get the good grades to get into a college and then completely fall apart in college because 99.9% of the colleges are not going to provide the support of a parent, an IEP, or a 504. So all of that things you're doing now are just these temporary Band-Aids that are literally bursting at the seams. You need to figure out something right now to find someone else to hold your child accountable to homework, find ways for them to do homework in a different environment than the home, maybe set it up with parents for them to do homework with a classmate or a library or at school, whatever it may be. I have never worked with a single family where the mom or the dad, it's most often the mom, let's be honest, ends up becoming the educational secretary to the child, the homework secretary, and I've never seen a single shred of positivity come out of it. It leads to a toxic relationship. It often leads to the mom, self-diagnosing the child with a number of different things, and it increases anxiety, and it's a major thing. You have to be the mom. You can't be the homework secretary, period.
And you can't be the executive function. You can't be your child's frontal lobe. That's something that, I learned from Sarah Ward. She says you can't be your child's frontal lobe.
100%.
And that's so true.
Yeah. And that's what leads to the learned helplessness. That's exactly what happens is every time you are your executive functioning, and so many moms out there end up becoming the executive functioning system for the entire family. The only way for their sons and even their husband, like the example you gave earlier, you have to fade back. And you have to allow these individuals to figure things out on their own because you're not always going to be there to support them, just like these therapists and these neurodiversity affirming therapists and whoever it may be. These people are not always going to be there to support them. These kids need to learn these skills themselves, period.
And you're not going to, shift away from learned helplessness by talking about it. Right? This requires action. So, Mike, I want to go back to something you said earlier about, allowing the child to experience natural consequences. One of the things I say to parents is this, that when you stop acting as your child's executive functioning, when you stop engaging in learned helplessness and stop rescuing them, their grades most likely will suffer. And this is why I always suggest, like you said to parents, you want to be proactive and explain to the teachers or the case manager, the guidance counselor, whoever, or all those people, we're trying to work on building independence and helping my, child improve their executive functioning. So there's probably going to be a decline in their grades. And part of what needs to happen is they need to experience natural consequences when I stop acting as their executive functioning. So one of the things, I think is important is that when parents explain that to teachers, then teachers have context for understanding what's happening. And I'm not saying they're going to grade them differently, but it's important that they know that your child is not willfully, missing assignments or getting things in late. There's a reason for it because you're trying to help them build independence and resiliency, which is going to serve them when they're, far done school. So that's an important part. Yeah, I just want to add.
And just like I said earlier, whenever I talk to a parent about natural consequences, so many of them will instantly jump back and say, but he's not going to care. Like if he gets an F, he's not going to care. If these things happen, he's not going to care. This is where authoritative parenting and having structure in the home is so unbelievably important because 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, why does that child not care about his grades? because he comes home from school and he plays Minecraft and Fortnite and Roblox for 10 hours. Any child with a hardcore screen addiction that is spending the majority of their life in the virtual world is not going to care about real world consequences. That's a good quote right there. I'm going to save that one. So any child that spends their entire life in the virtual world is not going to care about consequences in the real world. That's what you have to realize. And I'm sorry to constantly bring everything back to screens, but that's a big reason why your kid does not care about natural consequences. That's a big reason why morning routines, after school, social relationships are a mess, because of how often they're just living in the virtual world. The big thing with natural consequences is what happens when you have structure in the home, you have high expectations, and a lot of parents now are probably thinking to themselves, oh, but if I take screens away, what can I possibly dangle over their head like a carrot to get them to do things? Once again, I'm going to tell all you parents out there, if screen time is the only thing that you have to use against your child to get them to do things, you're in a world of trouble. You can't constantly dangle screen time over a child's head like a carrot to get them to do things. So you're going to need to eliminate those screens, pull those screens back, and start, using your attention as a natural consequence. They don't get your attention when they do the right thing, and they can respond to other people, enlist supporters like you talk about. Find other ways instead of those same copy and pasted accommodations, copy and pasted goals. Find ways for your child to meet with a teacher, meet with a counselor, and have them hold the child accountable to homework and grades instead of you doing everything.
Well, and one of the things I always say is that, kids need to be held accountable by other people besides their parents. So if you're allowing your child to, experience natural consequences because you decided to stop acting as their executive functioning, it's okay to reach out to the teacher and say, hey, look, Ryan didn't do this tonight. Can you please talk to him about it? Because when kids are held accountable by other people besides their parents, it's less comfortable, but that is also a valuable lesson in the real world because other people are going to hold them accountable, And the other part of that I always say is that, so many, both teachers and parents do this. They talk over the kids. So, kid is late with something, they don't hand something in. And then the teacher goes above the kid's head to the parent and says, Ryan didn't hand this in. And then they have a discussion about the kid, and the kid is not even involved in this discussion at all. And that is not helpful to kids at all. Yeah.
I see that all the time. There are so many, because, teachers, and to no fault of their own, executive functioning training is not part of their expertise and not part of their overall, training as they're getting their master's degrees and their degrees. So I can't tell you how many IEPs and 504s are just copy and pasted, and parents now get in that mindset of just give me everything, give me every service, give me every accommodation, even if it doesn't help. And these kids end up using, we were talking about learned helplessness here. How about these 75-page IEPs, 75-page 504s with every accommodation in the book? That's learned helplessness, really. Mm-hmm. And how many parents now are pushing to make sure that IEP lasts forever? Make sure my child gets every accommodation in the book as the parent's way of accommodating the learned helplessness. Give my child every service. Give my child every accommodation in the book until the day they graduate as a form of accommodating the child's learned helplessness.
All right, Mike, so let's give parents some actionable things they can do to help reduce learned helplessness. So my first one is, if you're sitting with your child doing homework, because that's the only way they'll do homework, you need to, number one, have a discussion with them and say, look, I'm going to stop doing this because I am confident that you can handle this on your own. I can come and help you if you need help, but I'm not going to sit here anymore and do this with you. And I would also suggest, you also have people who the child respects reach out to them and encourage them. I call this enlisting supporters. In this case, all they're saying is, hey, I know you can do this. And, I'm sure that, it's going to be a little rough at first, but I'm very confident that you can handle this, right? Just giving them some encouragement. So that's my first one.
Absolutely. So we're talking a lot about homework and issues with homework. My recommendation to these parents is to always have the child do it in a different environment. So, homework does not have to be done at home. It can be done somewhere else away from the parent. That's, that tends to improve homework completion a lot. But we also see a lot of learned helplessness with things like brushing teeth and things like, showering or setting up social plans, different things like that. This is where your lecture and your words are just going to feed into the learned helplessness. It is so important that, at times, for some of the younger kids, you can replace your verbal with visuals and create some visuals of what's expected of the child, but staying very short and sweet and letting the child know this is an expectation and not a choice. This is not something you are going to escape from. And as long as you have that structure in the home where the child's not escaping hygienic tasks, escaping going outside and playing and seeing friends face to face by being on their phone or being on screens, then you're doing the most of the job. You're doing exactly what you need to do by setting up that structure. And then you want to make sure that you are not constantly feeding in to the learned helplessness by providing words, attention, and focus on them until they do that task exactly how you want it, when they want it. Walk away and, come back and check in on them later to see what they've done. And you have to make sure they're not escaping on screens.
So my second one would be, Mike, to your point about, having visual scaffolding in place. And when we talk about visual scaffolding, we're not talking about lists or checklists. What I teach in Executive Function Crash Course is how to make a visual timeline so the child can see the sequence of steps they have to do in getting the task done. Because when we use that and we combine that with declarative language, then what we can do is we can help move them from, what we call prompt dependence. So, put your shoes on, do this, do that, towards independence. So for many kids with ADHD, aside from maybe being prompt dependent, what they will also do is just, sit there and do nothing. Because again, if they act helpless, their parents will, help push them along and, put the toothpaste on the toothbrush for them, right? Or whatever it is. And we don't want that because we want them to develop independence. So using strategies like a visual timeline can help with that. What would be your next one?
I was going to, talk a little bit about this pathological demand avoidance, and all of the information you're seeing on social media is really enabling learned helplessness. Do as much for your child because they can't deal with demands. So parents, you have to be very, very careful about this low demand parenting, because basically what that is doing is teaching the child learned helplessness. So anytime you can also bring in, find ways to just basically model to the child. Instead of lecturing to the child, do your homework, brush your teeth, do that. Just set it up naturally where you're brushing teeth together at the same time. Or when your child is sitting there doing work, you sit there and you do work too. Don't just sit there and hover over them. Sit there, have your child wear headphones, you wear headphones, and you do work at the same time. Stop telling your child, show your child.
Body doubling.
Body doubling. You got it. Absolutely.
There you go. Okay. So, Mike, I think for the last one, we should talk about, how learned helplessness can easily devolve into emotional manipulation. So, I have a graphic I used to show that it, shows how we start off with noise, and noise can lead to learned helplessness, and learned helplessness leads to emotional manipulation, or we can just skip the noise and start from learned helplessness to emotional manipulation. So let's first talk about what that looks like. So for me, when I see kids, when they're using learned helplessness and that's not working, and then they resort to emotional manipulation, what that often starts off with is self-defeating comments. I'm stupid. I can't do this.
Exactly. And emotional manipulation, we're going to have another episode about this because it presents itself in so many different ways. So we talked about this a little bit. Emotional manipulation is lots of self-defeating comments. And, sometimes kids with ADHD will really take that to the extreme and really say things for intense shock value where, any parent hears their kid say those things, it's going to affect you. So it's going to really take you staying strong in the moment and, practicing on self-care a little bit because you just heard your child say some really terrible things about themselves. So ADHD kids will take it to that extreme when they're trying to use every tool in the toolbox to avoid something. But, overall, we see them, saying negative things about themselves, and they'll also start to say negative things about you as the parent and how you're so terrible and how you're not, one big thing I'm seeing a lot of is the kids will just lay on the ground, scream, cry, and say, you're not helping, you're not helping, you're not listening. Especially when
used to do.
Yeah, especially when they're following our advice to ignore and to walk away and to not feed into this. The kids will then lay on the ground, kick and scream, and say, you're not helping, you're not helping. This is when that language of ready versus not ready, come to me when you're ready, come to me when you're ready to have a conversation is so incredibly important, because obviously kicking and screaming and rolling around on the floor saying you're not helping is the definition of not ready. So when the child's regulated, when they're calm, when they're in a good mood, when they're happy and relaxed, then you can have that conversation with them about ready versus not ready. And that's a very important thing that you are very concrete about and very specific about, and use that language as often as possible.
And when learned helplessness does turn into emotional manipulation, one of the things that always concerns parents is they say, well, what if he really means that, that he hates himself? Or what if she really means that she thinks she's stupid? And my answer to that is always the same. Whether they mean it or not, it is irrelevant, okay? Because the important part is you don't feed into it, okay? Because the more you talk about it, then the more you're validating it. So do you ever say things, that you don't mean when you're upset? Because I do. So if your child says something out of frustration, if they're resorting to emotional manipulation because, they don't want to have to do something, and they say things like, I'm stupid, even if they do mean it, again, you don't want to validate that, because that's something I see parents do so much. Anytime the kid makes a self-defeating comment, right? Oh, we're going to focus on this and we're going to talk about this and feelings and so on. And what I teach is, when you do that, and let's say the child doesn't mean it, okay? What you're doing is you're giving validity to something, and they can start thinking, oh, well, I didn't really mean that. I said that because I was frustrated, but look how much attention adults are giving to it. Maybe it is valid. And let's just say they did mean it. So again, if they did mean it and they maybe feel that way sometimes, the more attention you give to it, the more it's validating to them, and the more it's going to cause them to think, maybe I really am stupid, because otherwise, why would adults be giving this so much attention,
That's a really, really good point. And it's so incredibly important for parents to understand that when we're constantly doing things for our child, when we're constantly saving them, when we're doing homework for them, when we're emailing the teachers for them, when we're setting up play dates for them, when we're doing all of these things for them, what message is that really sending the child? You're teaching them that I'm incapable, I'm not good enough, maybe I am stupid, and I constantly need someone to come and save me. I can't do anything on my own. How is that going to develop positive self-worth? I totally understand the mindset of the parents of wanting to save the child and not wanting them to struggle and have anxiety and have, negative experiences. But without negative experiences, how are you going to gain skills? How are you going to have the necessary skills, beyond high school, beyond the IEP, and all of those different things? So this is what worries Ryan and I so much about this low demand parenting and, feed into all the behaviors because of their disordered nervous system and all of these things. How are these kids going to be prepared for life? And how are they truly feeling about themselves, knowing they can't do anything without help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mike, one of the other things is that I think, so many parents have gotten caught up in believing that everything is about self-esteem. And, and again, that the way we're going to do that is by, going to a therapist or cognitive behavior therapy. No, it comes from you recognizing your abilities within yourself. So the more you help your child build their abilities, the more you're helping them improve their self-confidence. The more you help them shift away from learned helplessness, no matter, how difficult this is, how much they might go kicking and screaming, it will ultimately help their self-confidence, because they're going to realize that they are more capable than they thought they were.
Exactly. And kids learning about themselves and kids learning about their own skills and being able to figure things out on their own, that's rarely going to happen within the walls of the home. They need to be out and about, playing outside, being in nature, being with friends face to face. The skills in Minecraft, Fortnite, Roblox are not going to transfer into real life in any way, shape, or form, or any iPhone game or anything like that. Kids need to have varied experiences and be out. And we're talking a lot about noise, learned helplessness, and emotional manipulation. So anytime you present a child with having to do a task outside of the house when they have ADHD, you're going to have to deal with behaviors first. I don't want to do that. That's stupid. I'm not good at it. I'm not playing soccer. I'm not doing karate. I'm not doing chess club. I'm not doing robotics. You as a parent need to make it an expectation and not a choice, because them learning these skills that do translate into real life and social executive functioning as well is what develops self-worth, self-confidence, resiliency, and grit. It's not so much from constant parenting in the home. It's them being out and about, surrounded by actual society.
Exactly. All right. So, Mike, I think we said everything we need to say about learned helplessness. Is there any closing thoughts you want to add?
I would say we certainly touched on it. I think that's really it, is in terms of, think about your child's resiliency and stop doing things for your kid that they're capable of. Fade back as much as you can.
And I think, Mike, the last thing that I want to mention is something that you brought up, is that I am really concerned about the amount of learned helplessness I am seeing social media influencers and even some professionals push to parents. And again, it's under this guise of being, quote, neurodiverse affirming or self-diagnosing your child with pathological demand avoidance. We are seeing so much of people encouraging learned helplessness now. It's really disturbing. So I just want parents to be aware of that, because I think, if this is not something that you're familiar with and you're just kind of following different people on social media, it's easy to think, see something on social media and think, oh, well, this person's credible. No, if they're pushing learned helplessness, if they're encouraging, right, you to go in and rescue your child or reduce demands, that is not helpful in any way. And that is consistent with what the clinical literature shows on this, which we've been talking about basically.
Correct. It's very easy to make, Instagram videos and TikTok videos telling parents what they want to hear of, oh, it's not your fault, your child is so disordered, pull back demands and make things easier on you. That's a very easy way to get likes and follows. And you may come across a page pushing low demand parenting with lots of followers. And in today's mindset, follower numbers equates with credibility and education. But that's not true whatsoever. Follower count is really, really meaningless. A lot of the people out there really pushing actual research and telling it like it is tend to have a real lower amount of followers than a lot of these people pushing these trendy things. So be very, very careful and make sure you get advice from the people who in person and the people that you follow the overall American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations on what's helpful and what's not.
All right, Mike, I think that's a great place to stop. Anybody listening or watching, if you would like us to answer one of your questions in an upcoming episode, please reach out to us at ADHDguyspodcast@gmail.com, and please make sure to include your child's age and medication regimen, or if they're not on medication, with your question as well. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Mike's practice, GrowNOW ADHD, please visit his website at GrowNOWADHD.com. To learn about the services Ryan provides, please visit ADHDdude.com. You can find Mike on Instagram at GrowNowADHD, and you can find Ryan at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. The ADHD Guys podcast and content posted by either GrowNOW ADHD or ADHD Dude is presented solely for general informational and educational purposes. The use of information on this podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, licensed mental health professional, or other qualified professional, diagnosis, or treatment. Listeners should not disregard or delay in obtaining professional advice for any medical or mental health condition they or their child may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.